August 18th, 1969. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. The rain comes down in sheets, hammering the jungle canopy so hard it sounds like rifle fire. Mud sucks at boots with every step, thick and red, pulling men backward as if the ground itself is resisting the war. The air smells of rot, wet canvas, sweat, and cordite that never quite leaves this place. Somewhere ahead, beyond the wall of green, a platoon-sized patrol is supposed to move forward. They don't. Second Lieutenant Robert H. Mallory, 22 years old, fresh bars still bright against his damp fatigues, stands at the edge of the tree line. His map is already soggy, grease pencil lines bleeding into one another. He checks his watch again, a nervous habit. The order is simple on paper. Search and clear grid square XR 412. Possible enemy movement. No contact reported, no supporting fires planned. Just walk in, stir the jungle, and walk back out. Mallory raises his hand, the signal to move. No one does. Private First Class James Red Kincaid, M16 hanging loose in his hands, stares at the ground. His helmet is pushed back, eyes red not from fear alone, but from exhaustion that is soaked into his bones. He's been in country 11 months. He knows this pattern. They all do. The lieutenant clears his throat. "Let's go," he says, trying to sound calm, authoritative. The rain swallows his voice. No one steps forward. Sergeant Luis Martinez, squad leader, late 20s, face permanently creased from sun and tension, turns slightly. Not toward the enemy. Toward his own men. He doesn't bark. He doesn't threaten. He just looks at them, reading faces the way he's learned to read the jungle. He sees it immediately. The wall. Not fear in the simple sense. Something heavier. Martinez steps closer to Mallory, keeping his voice low. "Sir," he says. "They're not moving." Mallory stiffens. "That's an order, Sergeant." Martinez nods. "Yes, sir, I know." Behind them, the platoon crouches in loose formation. Boots, sunk in mud. Weapons held, but without urgency. These are not cowards. These are men who've walked point through elephant grass tall enough to hide an ambush until it explodes. Men who've zipped body bags for friends whose names are already fading back home. Men who've learned the difference between a firefight that matters and one that exists only to fill a report. A helicopter thumps overhead somewhere far off, barely visible through the rain. No extraction plan for them. Not today. Kincaid finally speaks, his voice flat. "LT, we've been through that grid twice this month. Ain't nothing there." Mallory snaps his head around. "You don't decide that." Another voice, Private Eddie Lawson, barely 19. "Last time we went in there, Charlie waited till we turned around, took Jenkins. For what?" The name hangs in the air. Jenkins. Shot through the neck. Dead before the dust-off even landed. Mallory feels heat rise in his chest. He thinks of West Point manuals, of lectures on command presence, of the idea that discipline is what separates an army from a mob. He opens his mouth to speak and realizes something terrifying. They're not arguing. They're stating facts. This is not a mutiny in the cinematic sense. No raised rifles, no shouted slogans, no fists clenched in rebellion. It's quieter than that, more dangerous. It's a collective decision not to play along with a mission that feels like a lie. Martinez shifts his weight. "Sir," he says again carefully, "this is turning into one of those patrols." Mallory knows the term. Everyone does. Search and avoid. The unspoken adaptation soldiers make when survival starts to matter more than body counts. You move just enough to say you tried. You avoid contact. You come back alive. Officers don't write that down. Enlisted men live by it. The rain intensifies, drumming on helmets. Somewhere in the jungle, a single bird screeches and then goes silent. Mallory looks at the men. Really looks at them. Hollow eyes. Dirty faces. Fatigue so deep it feels permanent. He realizes that whatever authority he thinks he has, it's already eroded by months of orders that led nowhere, by missions that reset the jungle every morning as if yesterday never happened. Back at battalion headquarters, this patrol will become a line on a report. Area searched, no contact, or maybe movement limited by weather. The truth, that an American platoon quietly refused to advance, is not something anyone wants to admit. Mallory lowers his hand. "Hold here," he says finally. "Security." The men relax, just a fraction, not relief. something closer to grim confirmation. This moment will never make headlines. There will be no court-martial, no dramatic showdown. Just another small fracture in an army stretched thin by a war that no longer makes sense on the ground. And it is not an isolated moment. Across Vietnam in 1969, scenes like this are happening more often than commanders care to acknowledge. Orders given, orders heard, orders not followed in the way they were intended. This is where the breakdown begins. Not with ideology or protest, but with silence in the rain and boots that refuse to move forward into a jungle that has already taken too much. The rain eventually eases, but the decision doesn't change. The platoon sits in a loose perimeter, weapons angled outward, listening to the jungle breathe. Leeches crawl up pant legs. Cigarettes are lit and quickly shielded from view. This is still a combat posture. No one is pretending otherwise, but it's a posture built around not going forward. By late afternoon, Mallory radios in. His voice is clipped, careful. Negative contact, terrain impassable, holding position. The reply crackles back with irritation masked as professionalism. Battalion wants movement. Battalion always wants movement. Movement justifies presence. Presence justifies everything else, Mallory acknowledges. He doesn't argue. He also doesn't repeat the order to advance. That night, as darkness swallows the jungle, Martinez walks the line, checking claymores, whispering reminders, tapping boots where men have begun to doze upright. Kincaid sits with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning nothing and everything at once. "You think they know?" Lawson whispers. "Who?" Kincaid asks. "Back there. You think they know we didn't really go?" Kincaid exhales slowly. "They know enough." This is how it works now. Not open refusal, interpretation. Orders are bent, not broken. Patrols stretch time, shorten distances, choose routes that avoid likely contact. It's survival logic, learned the hard way. By 1969, most enlisted men in Vietnam have learned something officers rarely admit out loud. Aggressive movement without intelligence doesn't weaken the enemy. It feeds him. The jungle favors the patient, the hidden, the local. The war on paper still talks about initiative. The war on the ground teaches restraint. This isn't fear. Fear is sudden. This is calculation. Earlier that year, in the A Shau Valley, a rifle company from the 101st Airborne had pushed into a familiar pattern: insert, sweep, extract, only to be hit from three sides by NVA regulars who knew exactly where they'd be. The after-action report blamed terrain and weather. The survivors blamed predictability. Word travels fast among enlisted men. Faster than official briefings, faster than stars and stripes. Stories move through hooches, through helicopters, through letters home that never quite say what they mean. LT pushes too hard. Body count, don't match the blood. Don't walk point for glory. These aren't slogans, they're rules. Mallory lies awake that night under his poncho liner, rain starting again in a soft hiss. He thinks about command, about responsibility, about the invisible pressure coming down from above and the very real danger crouching just beyond the wire. He understands dimly that authority here is conditional. It survives only as long as it aligns with the platoon's sense of self-preservation. He also knows this: if he pushes too hard tomorrow, they may move, but not with trust. And without trust, the jungle kills faster. Elsewhere in Vietnam, the same logic is spreading. In the Mekong Delta, patrols begin moving slower than planned, deliberately missing scheduled checkpoints. In the 3rd Corps, infantry units report no contact at rates that don't match intelligence estimates. Helicopter pilots notice LZs being waved off at the last minute for unsecure terrain. Everyone is following procedure. And yet, the war isn't being fought the way it used to be. Commanders call it lack of aggressiveness. Enlisted men call it learning. By 1970, Army psychologists and military police are quietly tracking a rise in what they term combat refusal. Not dramatic refusals, those are still rare, but passive non-compliance, delayed movement, selective hearing, units that technically obey orders while draining them of intent. There are files filled with careful language, low morale, discipline issues, combat fatigue. None of them say the obvious, that many soldiers no longer believe the missions are worth the cost. Some do refuse outright. At firebase pace, a squad from the 196th Light Infantry Brigade declines to leave the wire after a night of mortar fire. The platoon sergeant argues. The men stand their ground, no weapons raised, just crossed arms, shaking heads, silence. It takes hours, and the quiet involvement of a senior NCO to defuse it without arrests. No one wants courts-martial, not officers, not command. Trials make headlines, headlines raise questions, and by now questions are dangerous. Back in Quang Tri, morning comes gray and humid. Mallory gives the order to prepare for extraction. No one argues. The patrol has survived another day. That, increasingly, is the metric that matters. As they move toward the pickup zone, Kincaid glances back into the jungle. He doesn't feel victory. He feels relief. And somewhere beneath that, a dull understanding that this war has shifted. Not in Washington, not in Saigon, but in the quiet calculations of the men ordered to walk first. The breakdown is no longer coming. It's already here. The first explosion doesn't come from the jungle. It comes from inside the perimeter. March 12, 1970. Firebase ripcord, Ashau Valley. The night is thick with humidity, the air barely moving. A small object arcs through the darkness and disappears behind a sandbag wall near the command hooch. A heartbeat later, the blast rips through plywood and canvas, throwing dirt and splinters into the air. When the dust settles, Captain William Bill Thompson is bleeding but alive, his leg torn by shrapnel. The men who rush him to the medevac don't ask who did it. They already know what it was. A fragmentation grenade, pinned, thrown deliberately, fragging. No one uses the word out loud at first, but by 1970, everyone understands what it means. It's the final step in a chain that begins with mistrust and ends with violence turned inward. Not against the enemy, but against command. Investigators arrive within hours. Statements are taken. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything unusual. The night was loud. Mortars had been falling for days. The jungle makes liars of everyone. The truth circulates anyway. Thompson had a reputation. Aggressive, obsessed with contact. He believed pressure was the only way to win, and he pushed his men accordingly. Night ambushes with little intel. Day patrols through known kill zones. He trusted doctrine more than experience. The enlisted men trusted neither. This is the point of no return. Combat refusal is one thing. Silent noncompliance is another. Fragging is something else entirely, a declaration that the bond between officers and enlisted men has fractured beyond repair. Between 1969 and 1971, the U.S. Army records hundreds of fragging incidents in Vietnam, some confirmed, many suspected. Most are never solved. Some targets survive, some don't. Every one of them sends a message, push us too hard, and we might push back. Not with words, with explosives. The effect is immediate and corrosive. Officers begin sleeping in separate hooches, away from their men. Helmets stay on inside the wire, sidearms are kept close, even among friendly faces. Trust evaporates. Mallory hears about ripcord weeks later. The story reaches him through a sergeant from another company, traded over warm beer at a rear base. The details change depending on who tells it. Sometimes Thompson was a monster. Sometimes he was just unlucky. The conclusion never changes. Guy got fragged. Mallory nods, says nothing. He doesn't condone it. He doesn't condemn it out loud either. He files it away as another data point in a war that no longer runs on loyalty. The Army tries to respond, leadership seminars, morale initiatives, a renewed emphasis on discipline, military police patrol base camps more aggressively. CID investigates grenade losses. Officers are told to be firm but fair. None of it addresses the core problem, because fragging isn't born from ideology. It's born from desperation and rage, from the belief that the chain of command no longer values your life, and it doesn't stay confined to rear bases. In the field, the fear of fragging changes how officers lead. Patrols become shorter. Risks are calculated differently. Orders are softened, couched in suggestion rather than command. Aggressiveness becomes optional, then rare. Some commanders adapt. Others retreat into paperwork, letting the war run itself. The enlisted men notice, by late 1970, the phrase "search and destroy" has all but vanished from their vocabulary. In its place is something unspoken but widely practiced: search and avoid. The mission becomes to return with everyone alive and enough activity logged to avoid scrutiny. Helicopter crews see it too. Insertions at the edges of grids, quick sweeps, early extractions. The war shrinks in scope, not officially, but functionally, and beneath it all runs a deepening silence. No one talks openly about refusal or fragging or mistrust. To admit it would mean admitting that the most powerful military in the world is struggling to get its own men to fight. The breakdown has moved past quiet resistance. Now it's armed. By 1971, the war still exists, but mostly in reports. Every morning, battalion headquarters hums with radios, typewriters, and the stale smell of coffee burned too many times. Situation maps are updated with grease pencils. Grid squares are shaded. Arrows point inward, outward, everywhere. On paper, units maneuver constantly. On the ground, they move just enough to sustain the illusion. This is how the war survives bureaucratically. In the field, Mallory watches it happen in real time. Patrols leave the wire late and return early. Contact reports are sparse and vague. Possible movement. Unconfirmed enemy presence. Numbers are rounded, details softened. No one lies outright. They just stop telling the whole truth. The pressure no longer comes from above alone. It comes from sideways, from peers, from sergeants, from the quiet expectation that you don't get men killed for statistics that no one believes in anymore. Mallory files an after-action report that mentions limited terrain reconnaissance. He does not mention that the point man deliberately chose a ridgeline route that avoided the valley floor entirely. He does not mention the moment when Martinez shook his head slightly, warning him off a more aggressive approach. Back at division, the report is accepted without question. This is the new contract. The Army pretends the war is still being fought aggressively. The men pretend to follow orders exactly as written. Everyone understands the gap between the two, and no one is eager to close it. The consequences ripple outward. Commanders rotate in and out faster than they can understand their units. Enlisted men count days on helmets, on cigarette packs, on the inside of their minds. Loyalty narrows, from the Army to the platoon, from the platoon to the man on either side of you. Anything beyond that becomes abstract. In I Corps, a company commander tries to reinstate strict discipline after a series of unproductive patrols. He orders longer movements, tighter formations, increased point rotations. Within a week, his unit's morale collapses. Men begin reporting sick. Weapons malfunction at convenient moments. Patrols bog down in endless security halts. Nothing he can punish. Nothing he can prove. By the end of the month, the commander requests reassignment. The war grinds on like this, technically intact, operationally hollow. The Army studies the numbers obsessively. Desertions are up. Drug use is rampant. Heroin, cheap and potent, flows through rear areas and into the field. Racial tension flares in base camps. Violence between soldiers increases. Military prisons fill. What alarms command most is not protest or fragging. It's indifference. Men stop caring whether the war's won at all. They care about rotation dates, about surviving until Deros, about not being the last man killed in a war that already feels over. Mallory feels it one afternoon while watching a medevac lift off with a wounded soldier. Another patrol, another booby trap, another name added to a list no one reads closely anymore. The helicopter shrinks into the sky, rotors chopping the air. No one salutes, no one speaks. This isn't collapse in the dramatic sense. It's erosion. Slow, relentless, invisible unless you're standing inside it. By now, Washington is already planning the end. Vietnamization, withdrawals, transferring responsibility to ARVN units. On paper, it looks like progress. On the ground, it feels like abandonment. Orders still come down. Units still deploy. But the trust required to carry out dangerous missions, real missions, has been burned away by years of contradiction. The Army is still present, but it is no longer fully engaged, and everyone knows it. By the time Mallory leaves Vietnam, the war has already moved on without him. June 1971, Tan Son Nut Air Base. The heat on the tarmac is brutal, radiating upward through thin soles as soldiers shuffle toward a waiting aircraft. Some laugh too loudly, some stare at nothing, a few clutch duffel bags like life preservers. Nobody looks back. Mallory stands in line, bars still on his collar, uniform faded and patched so many times it barely resembles what he arrived with. He's survived. That's the only metric that matters now. Not territory taken, not enemies killed, just survival. As the aircraft engines spool up, he thinks about the moments that will never appear in any official history. The patrols that didn't advance, the orders that were technically obeyed and practically ignored, the fear in officers' eyes, not of the enemy, but of their own men. The silence after explosions that no one investigated too closely. Back home, the war will be argued in numbers and speeches. Politicians will talk about strategy, about political will, about protests and diplomacy. What they won't talk about is this, that the U.S. Army at the ground level reached a point where large numbers of its soldiers no longer believed in the chain of command as a path to survival. That's the breakdown nobody admits, not because it's shameful, but because it's terrifying. An army depends on trust, trust that orders have purpose, trust that sacrifice is meaningful, trust that leaders understand the cost of what they demand. In Vietnam, that trust bled away patrol by patrol, ambush by ambush, report by report. Combat refusal didn't begin with ideology, it began with experience. Men learned which missions were deadly and pointless. They learned that body counts could be fabricated, but deaths could not. They learned that the jungle erased progress overnight, and they adjusted accordingly. Some refused quietly, some resisted passively. A few lashed out violently, most simply endured, counting the days until they could leave. The institution survived, but scarred. The lessons were written down later, in new leadership doctrine, in professional volunteer reforms, in an army that would never again rely so heavily on short-term conscripts fighting a long, ambiguous war. But at the time, none of that existed yet. All that existed were men in wet boots, staring at jungle they no longer believed they could conquer and making decisions that kept them alive, even if those decisions hollowed out the war itself. When the plane lifts off, Mallory feels the vibration through his seat, through his spine. Vietnam drops away beneath a layer of cloud. For the first time in years, the sound of the jungle is gone. What remains is the knowledge that wars don't always end when politicians say they do. Sometimes they end earlier, when the men ordered to fight stop believing the fight makes sense.